I'm sure it will be a fruitful event and a fruitful talk. I just want to find out if our streaming is online, Patterson. Okay, we are online, so I can continue. So, coming out and outing others. The situation surrounding coming out and outing others can be difficult to navigate, especially as it deals with safety, comfort, trust, and readiness. So early this year, this debate was sparked on our WhatsApp group. It has come out in LGBT Talks, and it is against this backdrop that we have invited Pierre here today to provide us with some input on this topic. The aim of this talk is to discuss, to analyze, to engage, and to learn about coming out and to better ourselves as a community, and so that we can help others as well, who are maybe just joining the community or who don't know anything about what we do and who we are. So I think I'm just going to quickly do a few words of introduction for Pierre, and then he can do the rest of the introduction. Pierre is very accomplished. And very old. No, very accomplished. He's the Deputy Director at the Center for Sexuality, AIDS and Gender, and he's a registered clinical psychologist with a master's degree. There are many more accolades. Pierre, maybe you can introduce a few more of them, but I will now hand over to Pierre. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is this on? Can you hear me? So I think I'm going to stand behind here so I can look at my notes, not because I want to have a boundary or barrier between me and you, also so that you can see me. One of the things about being short is visibility, which is, I guess, pertinent for tonight's theme. So, yeah, I am a psychologist by training. I started out my professional life in the 1980s, which is a very long time ago. When I trained as a psychologist, I got involved in HIV work, which is kind of a no-brainer if you were a gay person in the 1980s. That was the first wave of our HIV epidemic in South Africa. And it was very much, if you were out and about queer person, you saw what HIV did to our community. And then that sort of segued into working full-time in Hillbrow for about 8 years in one of the early municipal HIV programs. And then I came to work here at UP in this program. So my work is very much HIV, sexualities, gender work. I think if you do HIV work, you're doing gender work, because we still know that women are more vulnerable to HIV physically, socially, in terms of power, patriarchy. And if you do HIV work, you're doing sexualities work, because it's primarily a sexually transmitted phenomenon, and that helps us to ask, or invites us, I guess, to ask questions about what is it about people's sexuality that predisposes them to contracting HIV. How do we understand ideas like pleasure in the context of a disease that is all about fear and risk and anxiety? Currently, I'm involved in the Sexuality and Gender Division of the Psychological Society of South Africa. So a lot of that work is about advocacy around sexualities and gender broadly, but around queerness particularly. And I'm also a member of the Professional Association for Transgender Health, I think, which is a South African body which is affiliated to an international body that explores the needs of trans and gender diverse people in terms of physical and mental health needs. I guess there's more to say about my professional background, but it could get boring, so I wanted to make this a bit more personal. So what I thought I would do is share a little bit about my own coming out story, which was in the late 1970s. And what that was like for me, and what kind of thoughts I have about coming out. And then I'm going to, my second half of my sort of preliminary remarks is going to be around the second part of the question is, should we out other people? And when and why, and what are some of the risks associated with that? But in the interest of informality, please feel free to interrupt what I'm saying, put your hand up, ask a question, disagree with me. I don't have all the truths about queerness or coming out. but I have a point of view, and I'm willing to debate that with you, and you have your points of view as well. Just on a personal note, I'm obviously out at every possible forum. Wherever I speak, I talk about being out, and I think for me, that's a political thing. Because I think it's important to present queerness as unproblematic, as ordinary, as boring even. So in my professional life, if I'm doing talks, if I'm running workshops, I say I'm a gay man. I don't pause for the audience to collapse. I just carry on talking, because I think in some ways it could be, maybe even should be, ordinary. Maybe in some contexts it needs to be extraordinary. I'm in a relationship with someone who's not out. He's much younger than me and my partner. We've been together for about 7 years. And he's not out to his family. Now that's quite intriguing, because I'm like the most out person on the planet, and he's the most un-out person on the planet. And it does beg the question, I suppose, surely his family must know, right? A weird story: when he graduated with his law degree, he invited me to go with him to observe his graduation, but his main tickets, you get allocated a number of seats, went to his mom and dad and his brother and sister. So where was I? I was in another room where the graduation ceremony was being screened. So there's something very deep about that story, in the sense that the family got predominance, and I was relegated to a secondary space. And how did that feel? Not good, I have to say. And I remember he said to me, shame if he hears this talk, he's going to kill me, because I'm realizing now it's being streamed. But he said, can I borrow your camera? So he borrowed my camera and gave it to his brother to take photographs. And I was sitting on a wall watching this happen, this sort of photography thing. I was just an observer, not a participant. And I suppose, I guess it was a little bit hurtful. I'm not going to lie about that. I understood it. I have the maturity and the wisdom to understand that he needs to be out at his own pace and his own readiness. But maybe he should take that leap, because I know deep in my heart that his family will not reject him. I absolutely know that. But I also understand that fear of rejection is profound. Because even if you've convinced your mom and your dad, or whoever your parents or family are, love you, there's always that little percentage of doubt that maybe they will love me, but they won't love me being queer. And that's quite a hard thing to feel, because it's almost as if their love is conditional upon you being cisgender or heterosexual or normative in some way. So I think my first point, in fact I'm quite chuffed that I managed to lead myself to my first major point, was that coming out in a sense can be a provocation to our family. And now, of course there are families that are utterly unproblematically accepting, and maybe even ready and waiting for us to come out. I mean, I've seen loads of stuff online and TikToks where like there was one I saw recently where a young man comes out to his mom is gay, and she says, there's a box I've been wanting you to open for years. And in it was like the mom and the dad had written letters about whether they thought the child was going to come out as gay. So they were waiting and ready. But what I liked about that story is the idea that they were waiting for their son to be ready. So so it's a journey. The readiness is a journey. But I think one of the other things about why I use the word provocation is that I think, particularly in families where you being queer in some way is problematic, you are shining a light or a mirror back to them, because they can ask themselves, well, but we didn't parent a queer child. That wasn't in our imagination, but what we wanted. And so how come this happened? Because a lot of times people have this notion that queerness is something that is learned or taught or even caught. You know, the sort of contagion theory, like don't let our kids be exposed to queer teachers because it'll teach them to be gay. Meanwhile, the whole world is so cis-het. How is it yet somehow our queerness pushes through in spite of that, you know? So I think for some parents or some caregivers, it's like, how did we do this? How do we create a queer child? Because it's not what we intended to do. It's not what our values are about. If they're coming from a deeply cultural or faith perspective, it can feel like a shock. It can feel like a failure. It can feel like a rejection of their own abilities as parents. Of course, once parents work through that stuff, they come to realize often that it's not about how they parented. I can remember when I came out to my mother, I did so in a letter that I postage mailed to her. Remember, I grew up before the internet. I know that's a kind of unfathomable idea. Before computers, before email, before cell phones. So when you communicated to someone, it was by telephone or by letter. So I wrote a handwritten letter, before typewriters, even though there were typewriters, before computers. And one of the things I remember saying in the letter was that you may feel disappointed or sad or shocked or displeased, but and that maybe I've stepped out of the Catholic values that you feel you wanted to give to me. But I said, in fact, I'm deeply steeped in our family's values, you know, but where family is important, and you know, values are those of goodness and good works, if you like, kindness towards other people, caring about the world around you. That is who I am. So, you know, you've given me those things. It's not that I'm rejecting that part of you or that part of our family's values. I think coming out is always a process. So, you know, the literature talks about you come out often first to yourself, and then maybe to friends who you trust and know, possibly family, and then maybe further and beyond that. So the first person I came out to in terms of family was a sister. Prior to that, I was already out to two of my closest school friends. It was kind of weird because from the age of about 13, the three of us were inseparable. We did everything together. None of it was heterosexual. And I never even had a girlfriend at school. You know, so I guess it was not surprising. So when we came out to each other, I think the first thing we did was come out to each other. The second thing we did was to plan our first visit to a gay club together. In Durban, in the dark days of apartheid, where you walked into the club, which was in a semi-industrial area, and you walked up these steps and you would knock on a door, and there was a little sliding thing where the person would look out and check if you were gay enough or queer enough to come into the space. And naturally I passed. So when I came out to my sister, I remember one of the tactic that I employed was to send her a note or tell her I wanted to speak to her about something important. And why I did that was I almost created this unstoppable force that I'm not going to be able to not come out to her by saying I had something important to tell you. I knew I would pique her curiosity and she'd want to know, what is this thing? And two things she said to me, she wasn't in any way rejecting of me. The two things she said to me stick with me to this day, and they are, the first thing she said was, I'm worried about your safety. And it wasn't just from the sense of the laws of the country, because the Immorality Act was still in force in South Africa at the time, so that queer people could be prosecuted criminally if they were caught in sexual acts with particularly men, same-sex partners. Interestingly, also the Immorality Act prevented sex and love between people of different race groups. Clearly that didn't work. And the second thing, her fear about safety was that I would be hurt. That somehow I would be hurt in love, or hurt by other people's stigma, or rejection. So I appreciated where she was coming from. The second thing she said to me was, I don't want you to live your life in a ghetto. Which is such a fascinating idea, because I think she thinks of a ghetto as a closed off space, which doesn't have a permeable relationship to the rest of the world. That maybe ghettos are inward looking, ghettos don't breathe, that you can get caught up in a particular mindset perhaps, which is unrealistic about how the world really is. But I've come to think of the idea of a ghetto as a safe space, which we might retreat to, because a bit like what we have here tonight, you can sort of fairly reliably expect that I won't be rejected or judged, or there's certain things that I could just take for granted, that people get me about a ghetto. So I've kind of thought about all kinds of ghettos that we may live in. They can be physical ghettos, but they can be psychological ghettos as well. Are they bad or are they good? Maybe that's something we can debate. And then subsequently I came out to my brother, my younger brother, one of my older sisters, who many years later came out as lesbian. So I'm one of 6 children, 2 of us are queer, so the odds are pretty good in my family. And I've never experienced any rejection in my family, so I'm incredibly privileged in that regard. And in fact, I think what I occupy in my family's sort of constellation is the role of the bringer together, the connector, the checking up of how are you, let's get together, phoning people. And I think sometimes it comes with queerness, because we have had to think about who we are in relation to other people. And we develop a finely tuned sense of, is this person going to like me? We learn to read cues in other people often, because we constantly working out, is this person safe? Can I come out to them? Are they okay for me? I think I'm interested in the idea of coming in as opposed to only coming out. Does anybody have a thought about what I might mean by that phrase, coming in? Okay, that wasn't where I was going, but I'm going to come back to that theme, but that's nice, I like it.
It's kind of a little bit that is settling into your personality as now someone, because obviously there's the normalization of sexuality, cisgender, and then you realize I'm not some of those things, multiple, and then once you realize that, processing that and settling into that.
Yeah, so coming into your sense of yourself almost. Yeah, okay, that's nice. There was another hand, was there?
I was going to say the
Same thing.
I was going to say, like, as similar to coming into fashion, when something comes into fashion, you also come into yourself.
Right, yeah.
That's
Okay.
I just won't get up there. Coming into yourself, who you are as a person.
Okay, those are nice. I was thinking about the way I use the phrase is coming into your community or communities, because I don't believe in the idea of there being one queer community, because I think we have multiple identities. If you think of intersectional identities, so that our communities can be divided by race, gender, class, privilege, age, ability, religion. But the thing where I think coming in for me is interesting is that sometimes the queer worlds we come into have expectations of us. How to be a good gay or a good lesbian or a good trans person or a acceptable version of that thing. And that can feel okay, it's a new set of rules that we have to learn, but it can feel safe. in a dark room. I don't care if you do, frankly, but maybe if it's not you, coming into that world might think, oh, well, I have to become that kind of person, or I have to be a certain kind of trans person, I have to pass, for example, or fit into a neat binary. So I think that's sort of an interesting idea worth playing with. I'm interested in the idea of people who are never in. So, you know, if you were always gender non-conforming from a very young age, maybe people never thought you were heterosexual or cisgender, but they're not surprised. So some people might say, I never really had to come out because I was never in. And I think that's also quite an interesting thing to think about. I do think coming out's linked to internalized stigma, to pick up your point, in the sense that if you have an internal sense that your queerness is unacceptable or problematic, it's quite hard to like yourself, to love yourself, to feel a good sense of self-worth, and therefore your coming out can be apologetic. It can be, I'm sorry to do this to you, kind of language, or I wish I could have had a different outcome. Maybe these weren't your wishes and dreams for me. And I think that is tied up with an internalized, almost sort of spoiled identity or a troubled identity, because in putting yourself out in the world like that, I think you're allowing people then to re-stigmatize you because you feel second class. I think one of the things that I've been fortunate about, even though I grew up, for example, in the Catholic faith, which I think has been particularly hurtful to queer people, I've been fortunate in that I've been lucky enough to have a strong sense of my own worthiness. So even when I grew up in that space and in that world, I had this deep feeling that I'm okay, and I'm good enough, and I don't need to prove to anybody else that I'm an acceptable human being. And maybe some of my being is a little bit trying to prove to the world that I'm a good person. I would be willing to acknowledge that. So, you know, but the fact that I'm in a helping professions, that I care, that I reach out to people, I put myself out for other people, is a little bit like saying, I may be gay, but I'm a good person. And I shouldn't have to do that, right? I wonder whether we need to present a socially acceptable version of ourselves, like a sanitized self, when we come out. I think in the days of queer liberation, coming out was very much a political anti-establishment gesture. But now, when you read about same-sex parenting and queer families, it's almost like you're coming out into just an ordinary old suburban lifestyle. What happened to that protest quality that queer liberation had? So when I look at, you know, I follow this couple on TikTok who are two British gay dads who had a child through surrogacy. I mean, I have to say, if ever a child made you want to be a parent, this is this one. Adorable. They're gorgeous as a couple. They have this beautiful home and beautiful lifestyle. They love this kid and everybody loves them. But I kind of think, was this what queer liberation was about? Our right to be just like everybody else? Because I quite like the fact that I reject ideas around marriage for myself, for example, and ideas around monogamy, perhaps, or notions of monogamy versus polyamory, for example. I mean, I think they have their place, obviously, but I kind of wonder if they're just a plot of some kind to homogenize queer people. And then I think the last thought before I talk about outing other people is whether we feel in the coming out journey we are expressing or revealing to people we come out our authentic self. But what does that mean about the self you presented to the world until you came out? Was that self not authentic? Or do we have a different view, which is to say, that the self is an ongoing construction, and that we just simply are in the world with different parts of ourselves being expressed. Because otherwise it means that the being that I presented to people was inauthentic, and I don't know if I like that idea, because it was just perhaps a version of myself that I wanted you to see, but it wasn't a false version. I just edited out parts of myself that I didn't want you to know or think about. So those are some thoughts about coming out. On the question of outing others, I think this is a really tricky and contentious space, but I accept that it can feel like a political gesture in some context. So firstly, is it safe for the person who is being outed? So our intentions might be, for example, I'm thinking here, we may feel it's justified to out someone who is, let's say, using their social or political or cultural or religious power to say things about queer people that are harmful, but themselves are queer. When they're using a particular platform, which is a platform of power, to actually say and do things that are harmful to queer people, but we know that they are queer in various ways are hiding aspects of their identity, we might say, well, that person doesn't deserve to be in the closet. That, in fact, I have a political duty, a moral duty almost, to out them because they are doing harm to other queer people. I think we could debate whether that is acceptable, but what if for that person it wasn't safe for them to be outed, that they could be subjected to social harms or physical harms? What about if that person we're outing is married with children, and those children and other people that they know are subjected to bullying and victimization and harm? Once we've let the genie out the bottle, in the sense that we've outed that person who's doing harm, we can't control what happens to them socially, politically, culturally, or to their children and families. So we may be putting them at some kind of risk. And then I suppose the question is that fair to those other people who did not have a choice in whether their family member was in or out of that particular closet? What is my intention, I suppose? Because I think we can say our intention is political, but perhaps it is also motivated by something, anger or rage inside us that has not yet been processed. Maybe we've been bullied and hurt, and our fantasy is that if we out this person, they will be bullied and hurt, and it'll make me feel better. So there's sort of almost the idea of a revenge fantasy. So I think it is worth interrogating our reasons. And if, for example, Up&Out was going to make an organized, constructed decision to out somebody on campus, for example, who was doing harm, it never, it would have to be thought through really carefully, I would say.
Just to be clear, we will never do that. Even no matter what we think, it's not our place to make such a big decision.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't assume that you would. But the fact that it came up means that somewhere along the line, somebody had a conversation about whether it's a good thing to out other people. Yeah, I think the other point is that, when being out or coming out never really ends, because you're always going to meet someone who doesn't know that you're queer, I suppose. So it does feel a bit like, oh my God, at my age just let it out myself. It feels exhausting sometimes. Your hand is up, yes.
Firstly, the point that you made about...
I think we're struggling to hear you a little bit.
Hi, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Is it on?
But just hold it close to your mouth.
The point that you made about outing somebody who's on social media and public platforms, bashing queer people or putting, or
Hold it
like,
close to your mouth.
yes, okay, or just causing harm onto the community when they queer themselves, but in the closet, and that it's unfair. Not that it's unfair, but like it puts harm onto them and onto their kids. That's a really good thing to say, but I don't think that people like that deserve that, because they are doing harm on hundreds of queer people in where they are around the world, their families and stuff. So are we gonna sit and think of them and their family? Like, if they knew that they're a queer person and there's somebody who knows that they're gay but in the closet, but they go out of their way to be homophobic, to spread this information, to do harm onto other people, do they deserve that kind of compassion that, oh no, we're not gonna out you? I mean, it's a good thing to not, but like, do they deserve that kind of compassion?
Well, I think I have a view on that, but maybe other people in the room may have a view too. So should we give the person our compassion?
Hello, can you hear me? So when you were kind of doing your opening portion of tonight, you were saying that you're kind of aspiring to make being gay, being queer, being part of the community boring. And I was like, you know, but I kind of associate with that the kind of, we're all special little snowflakes, but just because we're queer doesn't necessarily mean that you're exempt from your actions and the consequences thereof. So if a hypothetical political person is doing harm to a community, but specifically to a community that they are now part of, that doesn't necessarily then mean that their actions don't have consequences. So if the best road, the best method to stop this is to say they're part of the community, then I do think that that is acceptable, because you're being held accountable.
I mean, I'm agnostic in a sense on the question of whether we should or shouldn't. I just think I want to put out there the different things we would think about. What are you thinking?
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah? I don't think it's ever a solution. I think holding a person accountable to their actions directly and how they affect a community is different to putting someone's personal life on blast. And even if it isn't a personal life, let's say, you know, they were 16 and they hooked up with a girl, and since then they've been celibate, and that person comes forward, or etc. Putting a person's life on blast is different to holding them accountable. Taking someone who says something and does something wrong and saying what they're saying and what they're doing is wrong, and we should hold them accountable for their actions, and saying, look at this person, they're gay, they're a hypocrite. That is, it's slinging shit. You don't want to stoop to that level. Like, I understand what you guys are saying, you know, it's the lesser of two evils type of energy. But is it really? Because if you're stooping to the person and the people you hate's level, then are you really the better person? Like...
Okay, there's another hand here.
I also think we forget about how intense violence towards queer people can be, especially in a society where, like, queer positive people are so vocal. It's easy to forget the risks that queer people take in being out. I mean, like, say for example, I know one person that their family kicked them out because they were queer, and I think if you out a person, you not only risk that, but you also risk, this is a hypothetical example, right? Say for example there's this like violent like vigilante anti-queer group and they find out, oh no, one of their members is queer because someone's like, hey, aren't you queer? Aren't you being a hypocrite? What happens to the violence that they undergo? I think it's so easy to sit from a high pedestal and say, oh yes, I would do that. But then when it comes down to the actual situation and when you actually see the violence, it's like, wow, maybe that wasn't the best course of action.
I hear you, because I think if people come to me as a psychologist or just as someone who's an ordinary queer person, should I come out or should that person come out or should I tell them to come out? My first thing is it safe? Is it physically safe? Are you safe with your home, your family, your community? Because we also know that some of the things that queer people are subjected to is conversion therapy or attempted conversion therapy, which is forced attempts through prayer and rituals and psychotherapy to make the person unqueer, and that is a profound harm that is done to people, and it's a real rejection of their humanity and their dignity and their worth. I don't know if you know that one of the aspects of the apartheid military project was to subject some gay men to shock therapies to make them ungay, and some of those people were permanently harmed from that. And forms of conversion therapy are happening to this day in South Africa. So when someone is outed against their will, that could be potentially a consequence. But I think it would be useful in this discussion to distinguish between outing someone who has deliberately harmed the queer community versus outing someone else because we just think it's going to be good for them. It's never my right, I think, to make that decision for somebody else. But having said that, there's lots of buts and caveats. There have been situations where people have been outed against their wishes and then they're grateful, paradoxically, because, well, at least I didn't have to make that decision myself and now it's done, I can get on with my life and it wasn't so bad.
Just to tie in with that, back in the UK, back in the day, they also used to chemically castrate gay men. So it was very often a thing of, if you've been outed, the government literally locked you up in a box and castrated you, which means that a lot of gay men ended up growing breasts because no more testosterone production. A lot of things happened, and it happened all over the world. There are still people being put to death for being gay.
Absolutely. I mean, it's still a thing today that some parts of the world, queer people might be subjected to torture by the state, imprisonment, in some rare instances, forms of capital punishment. So we live in an incredibly privileged space, not all the homophobia and transphobia notwithstanding in South Africa. We live in a privileged society that has our constitution. So I suppose there are questions about autonomy and dignity that I think are worth thinking about, that should I have the right as a queer person to decide when I'm ready to tell my story, and nobody in a sense should have the right in theory to take that away from me.
Okay, thank you.
Comment, question.
This question is a bit diverging from the topic, but still on the same topic. It comes from the YouTube online
Okay.
comments. This member is asking about outing someone with pronouns, like when you don't know when a person is out, so you don't know which pronouns to use. I think they're hinting at they want to respect a person's pronouns, but because they're not out, they don't know what to do,
Yeah.
how to navigate that situation. Do you have advice for us?
That's a hard question.
I know, it's quite a hard question.
I think, let's hear your thoughts and then I'll tell you what I think. Bring me the microphone.
I think also it depends on your situation.
Yeah.
So a lot of the conservative, especially the vocal conservative people, they're like, oh no, pronouns are bad, and when in reality, pronouns are actually part of everyday English and we use them for most things. But I think if you are part of a vocal conservative community, it would be easiest to refer to them as their presenting gender. However, if you, like myself, are unapologetically like leftist and like gung-ho queer, it's almost like it's almost like a respectful thing to refer to them as a they them.
Yeah.
And because you don't really know like what they are and how they prefer to be called, so it's a they them. It's the easiest for me personally.
So there's some other thoughts in your hand over there.
If you don't know, ask.
Yeah.
I think it's very specific to the person. So some people really aren't comfortable with their pronouns being shared, especially in the context of if you're going to their house and their parents don't know, for example.
Yes.
You ask them. If you're in a situation where you're referring to someone directly, like by their pronouns, then you probably know them well enough to ask that question. To be like, hey, are you out to your parents or are you out to this group of people? Can I refer to you as yourself, or do I need to use another set for you? And I think defaulting to they them for public figures is a very good practice to get into. And they them isn't necessarily outing unless it's an interpersonal situation, in which case you should definitely check. And that clears up so many issues. Ask privately, not in front of the person, obviously, but that avoids so many awkward situations, so many problems, so many things that you where you didn't know that you were going to cause a problem for this person. If you just ask, everything goes away. It's all good.
Thank you for that. I think that's a very wise approach. What I'm finding with younger colleagues is that they're using they them more regularly just to describe everybody. And so one of the ways around the situation, because how I read the question was almost like you're referring to a third person, and who is either non-binary or genderqueer in some way, that you're afraid to use them and they because that'll out that part of them. But if you've established yourself as regularly using them and they, then you basically could say it's my general default setting to describe anybody, in which case you have a sort of an out, as it were, that way.
I'm studying law, and I have met a few queer people, and there's obviously queer people around, but in general, a lot of people in my faculty know me as the queer. I'm the one that brings up the topics, that starts those kinds of discussions, that actively leans forward and listens when it comes up, even in little bits. So I had to stand up yesterday in front of class, and it was the first time that a lecturer asked our pronouns, which was really, really sweet to me. And I told her afterwards, this is a new thing, because I got to stand in front of the group. We were doing class reps, and I got to be announced as class rep with they them pronouns, which is really cool. That is a really new development. And she asked, which I think is linking to that communication aspect, is you're not hurting anyone by asking. They can decide to tell you, they can decide to say, I'm non-binary, but don't say it in front of the entire group, please. Thank you very much. So that's just my little 2 cents. It's cool.
The law faculty's been amazing. So I'm reasonably proud to say I was part of the team that developed the trans protocol that we have at UP, which set in motion students being allowed to register online and use their pronouns and change certain things. And the law faculty was amazing. A couple of people there helped to set up the trans awareness microsite, and it gives wonderful suggestions to lecturers about how to approach the question of pronouns. So I think it's really cool that that's beginning to happen, and it needs people kind of to be out, doesn't it? Well, I suppose you could say, well, I'm doing it because I'm a believer, but when you say, look, this is me, and these are my pronouns, this affects me, that's a very powerful witnessing you're giving.
It wasn't even like a philosophy or like a human rights thing, it was literally payment methods.
Right.
Right.
So I have another question from the chat. This
Yeah.
is again about public figures. So when is outing someone, and when? Oh, okay. Sorry, I read it wrong. When is it outing someone, and when is it speculating about a public figure? So there's a lot of speculation, for example, around ex-public figure being bi, and is that then outing someone, or is that just talking about current affairs? If that can make sense.
Yeah.
I hope I conveyed this question correctly.
You have a thought, but my own thing about the social media. Remember, I grew up in a pre-social media world. I think social media can be really toxic and really cruel and really kind of the worst, brings out some of the worst of human nature. So I think endless speculation about a celebrity, for example, is frankly just cruel and gratuitous. And I think you have to ask, what are the intentions? Because actually what's circulating in society is almost like a kind of policing of people's gender, of their sexuality, and in the end it creates this kind of climate of fear and anxiety. Why should someone be subjected to that? I find it mystifying and unacceptable and problematic. Sorry, I've just aged myself by 1,000 years there. Back in my day. Because if you think about it, that person's ability to maneuver and just be in the world is limited by the scrutiny that they're subjected to. The whole gaze of the world is on them. Who they're seen out with, what they do, what they post. It becomes like this living under a microscope, and I don't think that's fair.
I also think it perpetuates like a really harmful stereotype and narrative when people are closeted and they're just gay, and so they're evil because they're a closeted gay person. We see it a lot in movies where the bully who bullies the queer kids turns out to be gay. And like, I mean, it's overplayed, that's the first thing. And secondly, like, mind your business. Like a person, you don't know what the person's going through, and maybe they're just an asshole, and that is also just fine as well. But like, even unproblematic celebrities, like Shawn Mendes, for example, people keep speculating about his sexuality, even though he's said multiple times, I am not gay, I am not queer, I am straight. And like, it keeps perpetuating that stereotype that if you're flamboyant or feminine or soft or, you know, not a high value alpha male, you're a queer person. And like, it's queer people perpetuating the same stereotypes that are used to oppress them again and again on other people. And like, it's not okay, because like, you wouldn't like it if you were in the closet and someone was like, ABCD person did something, and you're like, oh, it's giving share, and they're like, this person's gay. Like, that's not, you would be bullied and harassed, and it's the same thing for these people. And even if they're problematic, like saying, oh, well, this person's a bully, they're obviously gay. Like, think about, like, just feel that sentence in your mouth. This person is a bully, they're obviously gay. Like, why are we normalizing people having internalized homophobia, being outwardly violent to other people, and just saying, this person's a bully, full stop. Stop bullying people because they're different. Maybe, you know, they come to God and they realize they're gay. Cool. But for now, there's no point in like doing that, because it's harmful to the people that you do it about.
You know, I also think that some, like in the case of men, they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. If they exhibit a kind of gentle or other masculinity, which we want, because we think the more toxic forms are unnecessary, and then they are different, and then we say, well, they must be gay. So, you know, they can't just be themselves.
I have a question regarding coming out of the self. One of your points, you mentioned that coming out is a process, and for me that was a very continuous process. So I have to continuously do it over and over again in different settings. And with your field in psychology, how would you advise that people like us who have to come out so many times, so often, how do we deal with that exhaustion that comes with coming out?
I think sometimes finding your people and just commiserating with each other is a good thing. You know, sort of to be around other people who face the same struggles is important. I also think maybe sometimes it's about choosing your battles. You know, that TikTok couple that I talked about who are parents, and there was a recent TikTok, the one guy said he was with his baby somewhere out in a shop, and the woman said, "Oh, are you doing daddy duties today? Your wife's at home, or your wife's busy." And he said, although I'm out to the world, I mean, he's on TikTok as a gay dad, he said, yeah, no, she's busy. Because he said, I just felt exhausted. I didn't have the energy. Like, do I owe the cashier in Checkers an explanation about my sexuality? Sometimes you want to turn it into a teachable moment. So I've had the experience often in my life of being misgendered. Even though I have no hair and I have a sort of a greyish beard going on, there's definitely something about me that's androgynous. And particularly what I call peripheral androgyny. It's a term I made up. That out of the corner of the eye, the periphery, they see this being and it reads woman to them.
Everyone in this room is feeling that.
Okay. Peripheral androgyny. You better cite me on that one. And they turn to me and say, can I help you, man? Can I pull these words back into my mouth? And mostly I'm quite chilled about it and I just move along. And occasionally I will say, if I'm in a particular mood, I might say, oh, it's interesting, don't be uncomfortable, it's okay, you know. And once I asked somebody working in exclusive books, so she hadn't misgendered me, but she called me sir, which is fine, I don't care. I mean, I don't feel particularly sir-ish most of the time. But I said to her, as a matter of interest, if you have a customer who you look at them and you say, in your head you think, I cannot read this person's gender, how do you address them? Because you only got ma'am and sir in your toolkit. And she said, oh, I never thought about that before. And maybe after that she started thinking about it. And I even once wrote to Woolworth customer services when I was misgendered. And I said, look, I don't care about being misgendered, but when you only have ma'am and sir in your customer service toolkit, you're doing a disservice to people who are non-binary or genderqueer or just different, or you just can't read. You need to have something else. And they kind of said, oh, thank you very much, your feedback, and I'm sure it went into the shredder. But I sort of moments of wanting to be political about it, but I don't think I have a clear answer for you other than, you know, recharge your batteries when you feel with your people. And sometimes you just are just too tired and you let it go. Is a hand
Also,
here? Yes.
the thing is, I think that society also comes back to the cis-het normative part of the world. Is they are so vocal about being straight and being cisgendered, and this is how the way it is. And so sometimes I feel like queer people, in order to feel accepted, they need to feel like they need to label themselves, which I think is quite harmful, because when I first came out and I was like, oh, what if I'm this, what if I'm that, what if I'm the other thing, and now I'm kind of feeling like, you know what, labels don't really matter. I don't even owe it to myself. I don't owe it to other people, I don't owe it to myself. I can just be comfortable existing, really. And if as sometimes it's down to like exhaustion, or other times it's like just because you don't care what the other people think of you. I just think that labels, although they are helpful and they help you find out who you are, I think they can, if they get too niched and you feel like you owe it to the world that you have to say, oh, I'm this, that, and the other thing, I think they can be quite harmful to the queer experience as a whole.
Yeah. And I think it speaks a little bit to my coming in idea, that you feel obliged to put a particular label on yourself in certain queer spaces, and maybe you're not ready for that label, maybe your label changes, which is cool. Yeah.
I just want to touch on something you mentioned a lot earlier. So I remember you talking about your personal experience and how you're the person in your family who like connects with everyone and keeps in contact and stuff. And personally, I was like, oh, that's not me. But as you were talking, I was thinking about it, and I think that's something that only happens when you come out. Because for me personally, until last year, which was when I like properly came out to my family at the end of the year, until then I've like had no desire to really like keep in contact, or like I would completely forget to phone my parents or like just message on my cousins and check up and stuff. And I think after coming out, something inside of me was like, oh well, my family still loves me. So this year I've been like a lot more, I want to go home, and like phoning almost every second day. And I've noticed this change like being so prevalent, but I never understood why. And you just like kind of helped me understand that, which is really cool.
Yay.
Yay.
That's a lovely story, and I think one of the things we do sometimes as queer people is that until we come out, we present an edited version of ourselves to our families. And part of the editing is if I avoid certain intimacies and vulnerabilities or opening up conversations with my family, I run the risk of them asking me, do you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or what's going on with you? So you kind of keep an emotional distance. And once you've opened up that box in a way that it gives you the ability to then deepen your relationship with them, which is wonderful. So thank you for that.
Yeah, that's another
Too sentimental?
Too much therapy.
Too much therapy.
Thoughts that need to go through my brain right now.
I would be doing a disservice to my profession if I didn't bring that in. But sorry, before the next person, I also think the editing stuff, particularly for someone of my age and generation, has done quite a bit of damage to me, because I learned to ring fence certain topics and conversations and willingness to be open or closed. And I found that even to this day, there are certain things I won't talk about with my family. I know it sounds paradoxical, since I'm apparently the most out person on the planet, but because that process of self-editing has become second nature to me. But I cannot not do it in some circumstances. It's survival. I mean, I remember growing up in a time when we used, in the gay male community, which was frankly quite sexist and misogynistic, we'd use women's names for things, or you'd give your male partner a woman's name as cover, in case in conversations you got caught out. And I think, that's a bit sad in a way, because it shouldn't have to be like that. There was a hand somewhere there.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to touch on two things. First of all, I think in your intro, you kind of mentioned, or you kind of posed the question of almost having these heteronormative behaviors or ways of life, such as raising a family and such.
Right, yeah.
I think, maybe one of the views or one of the reasons why we've had this fight, or that the anti-establishment stance, is so that we can participate in some of those, let's say, having a family or being married, the privileges and the rights that come with such, right?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to know, like, why would that be a problem? Not saying that you have a problem with it or anything, but like, why would it be a problem if I just want to participate in this plain vanilla type behaviors? And then the second point was, on that topic of not labeling yourself or not wanting to be accepted, or just screw the cis community and such.
Yeah.
I think if you're wanting, or if you're asking a world to be more accepting and ask questions, you need that world, that very world, to understand what they're accepting. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So
No, fair.
yeah.
I mean, I belong to an online kind of discussion group of queer people. We had a meeting last night, and somebody said, what do I do when my colleague says, so in your relationship, who's the man and who's the woman? Okay. And we kind of had this long debate about, well, do we have a duty to educate people? And like many of us said, no, they must do their work. But the point I made in my reflection on that question was that what the heterosexual gaze does is problematizes queer identities and sexualities, but it leaves their own sexuality unproblematized. So I said, what if we said to that person, if it was a woman colleague of this gay man, if I said to her, if a straight woman uses a dildo on her straight husband and penetrates him, who's the woman and who's the man? And it was like almost like I wanted to provoke this conversation that gender and identity and positioning are complex and personal, and they aren't only the terrain of queer people. That heterosexual sexualities are kinky and varied and interesting and complicated as well. To your first part of your question, of course people can choose what appears to be, the ordinary life of creating family and children and so on, and I absolutely welcome and accept that. But I do think where I have a problem is if we try and mimic and parody the heterosexual paradigm. And I think what queer people are very good at doing is creating unique family forms and structures and systems, and those are equally valid. And we should be able to say, I have a family, I want children, but we're raising it in a polyamorous setup. Or there's this couple on who are obviously my yardstick for everything queer. They had their child through a surrogate womb, so a woman they found carried the baby, but the egg was from somebody else that they do not know, I think. And the sperm came from one of the couple. You can see which one it is because the baby is identical. But the surrogate mom and her husband and her kids are part of their extended family. They meet regularly. So I think, how cool is that? So I think what surrogacy and IVF and all that kind of stuff has created is new family forms and new rules and new ideas, which I think is really cool and interesting. I don't know, does that add to your question? Cool. Do you have a question? And then we'll go to you afterwards.
All right, so this is a bit of a heavier question. So, for example, I'm going to use my own personal experience. I came out to my parents in 2020 when I just started dating someone. 3 weeks later, she broke up with me over text. Not a great time. So my parents decided that I had made a mistake. How do I come out to them again and this time make it permanent so that they're not like, oh, this is just a phase?
Well, it's not for me to tell you what to do, I suppose, but I think what their reaction represents is a struggle to accept that you're genuinely lesbian or queer in some way. And so probably when you broke up, they were immensely relieved and want to buy into a particular narrative that was just a phase or an experiment. And maybe they need time to grieve a little bit the idea that they had for what they wanted in a daughter. But I would, if I were you, when the time was right, because I think timing is everything, to kind of say, by the way, this is me. That wasn't a phase. It wasn't that I was just experimenting, or she didn't, drag me to something that wasn't me. This is me, I'm interested. You could say to them, how do you feel about the idea of it actually being me and not a phase? I don't know if that offers anything. Sure.
Hello. Yeah. I also feel like it's important to acknowledge that cultural thing in terms of just going off of what you were saying with people who want to take part in, the getting married and the having children. I do think an aspect of it is cultural, at least coming from like a Xhosa household, like, and also just the way like coming out, as I think coming out has been westernized a lot and has been like definitely centered as a very white-centered conversation, because I feel like when you grow up in like a very traditional African family, you already learn how to edit. Like from the moment you talk, you have to edit. You can't, I don't have the conversations with my parents about my partners or sex, never, could never. And like that's just an African thing, or well, I guess a Xhosa thing. And so like I feel like I've never had to feel the need, well, previously, never had to feel the need to come out. Even now, I guess, I don't really feel the need to come out, because it's one of those things where it's like, there's always gonna be that boundary between my relationship with my parents and my relationship with the rest of the world. And even when I was outed-ish, I did a lot of PR for that. I kind of, the way my parents formed it was, whatever you do in your community and in your privacy, that's your business. But it shouldn't be reflected back on us as a family. And so I think that's kind of how, yeah.
So 2 reflections on your intervention. I think which I think is an important one, because we have to think about these ideas and to what extent they reflect a kind of international gay discourse, and to what extent that's indigenized. I have a friend from Kenya who is gay, but he's not out, okay? And he would probably articulate similar ideas around privacy, etc. But what he faces is relentless, and I mean relentless, questioning about when he's getting married. It's everywhere. It's his colleagues, it's friends, it's family. Every time he goes back to his rural community, so much so that he says to me sometimes, I feel like I either want to leave my country or I want to marry a woman just to be a smokescreen. And my response to that is, but what about her? What about her needs? I mean, is it fair? And if she goes into it with open eyes and you're transparent, that's different, because maybe she could be a lesbian woman and you cover for each other. But I feel the relentlessness of the when are you getting married question has been psychologically harmful for him. So his family just don't let him be. Do you know what I mean? He's got to constantly perform a certain kind of heterosexual masculinity. My second answer is, how do you feel about same-sex couples invoking things like lobola, for example? Because that's invoking tradition, a practice which has been around since time immemorial. My anxiety about it, and I hope this isn't read as a sort of a white-splaining, or is does that reinforce ideas about gender? Because it's like, who is the man and who's the woman? Who is the paid for? Who is the payer? And that is sends off alarm bells inside me, because I think it colludes with a particular view of same-sex relationships, that there has to be a gender binary operating of some kind. I don't know, do you have a thought about that, or anybody else in the room?
I guess in terms of the first point with the, when are you getting married? I think sometimes it's tiring to be badgered by your family, but then I think like you badgered about your family about everything, like it's when are you gonna get this? When are you gonna do this? When are you gonna do that? When are you getting this job? When are you gonna go see your aunts and uncles? Are you gonna have a child? No, you're not gonna have a child. Are you gonna have a child with that one? You should never marry a Zulu. It's always, I like to say, Xhosa mothers especially, they will nitpick till kingdom comes. And I feel like with that, it does create a psychological trauma and a psychological barrier that you don't really overcome. And I feel like even being out, it never really ends. And I think that's a cultural thing. And then with the lobola one, I mean, personally, I would love to participate in lobola. And I think, I understand what you mean. I think it recenters it in this gender binary, but I think in reconstructing African culture around queer ideology, looking at it more at like, okay, looking at more of less traits and looking at how we can make it a little more gender ambiguous. So, for example, do we want to lobola both couple? I mean, give blankets, give beer to both families, and I mean, some people are happy. Some people are like, okay, the more nurturing, the more nurturing, quote unquote, motherly person, gets the lobola because they will be more nurturing to the kids. And I feel like there needs to be a conversation around restructuring, especially traditional indigenous culture to queer spaces, but also understanding that like there is gonna be that sense of, well, I don't feel like I need to tell my parents who I'm dating until I'm getting married, and that's okay because like I mean I've talked to people and they're like, oh, so you're not out, and I'm like, I'm out to everyone. You go on varsity, everyone knows who I am. I'm out. But for my parents, even if I was straight, I would never bring my partner, present my partner to my parents unless I knew I was getting married to that person.
Cool, okay. Thank you. That's a very thoughtful intervention. Hand here. Oh, there first. Deep breath.
Yeah. I think there might be a lot of pressure on queer people to not show up as like stereotypes. I don't think a person can be a stereotype. I think a stereotype is something that's applied.
Imposed
So
on them.
I think a person in a queer relationship can't really be heteronormative unless they're like actively being misogynistic, in which case. But there is a lot of pressure to break that. But I think queer people should be allowed to like relax into whichever roles they want to, if that makes sense. And you see this a lot with like butch and femme couples, where people will be like, you guys are you're role-playing heterosexuality. And it's like, no, it's not. It's two women or two gender non-conforming people. And I think there's often a lot of like pressure to not do that. And I dislike the framing, if that makes sense. I don't think two queer people can ever really imitate heterosexuality unless they're actively trying to.
I suppose I could say that if you have, I mean, I sometimes when I talk about racism, I would say I was marinated in a racist society, and so I can't ever undo that inside me, although I make very good attempts to. We're all marinated in a cis-het world. So you could also argue that it's not just that we should point the finger, if you like, at that couple who appear to be mimicking these binaries, but maybe say, let's unravel that system and contribute to that conversation about, so we can all just be in the world without all those labels being, or expectations on us. There's a hand at the back, I think. Oh, okay, you'll come next.
Hi, I just have an online question. I don't know
Okay.
if it's in line with coming
The
out
topic?
necessarily, but
Yeah.
do you have any gender neutral alternatives to sir or ma'am or any honorifics like that?
I don't right now. I'm a customer, yeah. I've actually thought about that, because if someone is in a Woolies or whatever and says, good day, if they say, good day, can I help you? I feel like that's okay. So I'm interested that we have to add the gender title to it. But I also know that for some people, it's impolite not to use some kind of gender word. And so for them it would be really hard. But sometimes attitude like, hi, can I help you, would be a good way to do it. So, but please come up with another word, somebody. Yes.
Hi.
Hello.
My name is Latita. Can everyone hear me? Well, what do you do when... So, backstory, my parents are kind of pastors. They quite important in church, and so I grew up in a very church-orientated family, right? So my parents are pretty close with the pastor, everyone in church. They kind of the ideal couple at church, right? So what do you do when the pastor keeps on outing you out? Like every session is literally about you, and I haven't even come out yet because I'm quite androgynous, so I didn't even have to come out. They just speculated, predicted, and it was that. So every session right now is literally about me. And so how do you respond to that? When you guys are even in support of
That question makes me feel very heavy, I have to say, because I think that's really unacceptable to do that to you. I mean, I would find another church, maybe, or speak to the person. Go.
So, well, that's quite difficult.
Yeah, okay.
Especially for an African person,
Yeah.
right? I'm spiritual,
Yeah.
but then it's becoming quite controversial right now because I'm thinking, what am I actually supposed to do?
Yeah.
You go back home, it's the same conversation day in, day
Over
out.
and over
I mean,
again.
I haven't even come out yet.
Yeah.
You speculated.
Yeah.
How am I supposed to respond? Because I didn't even create a response.
Yeah.
I didn't even know what I was going through, and already you predicted my whole life. What?
Yeah.
How do you respond to that?
I mean, I'm to be honest, I don't have any nice answers for you, but other than just to acknowledge how painful and difficult it must feel to be constantly put in that position. I mean, if you are able to have a one-on-one with that person and explain how it makes you feel, would you be in a position to do that, or even find an ally in your faith community who could be with you in that conversation, and say that actually this is it's traumatic to do this to somebody and to constantly put them under that kind of scrutiny. Is a one-to-one with that person possible?
Pastor or my parents. I mean,
No.
I don't even think it's possible at this
Yeah.
point. They got their own views. Ever since, like, when the conversation starts, it clashes.
Yeah.
As soon as I say something, I'm wrong. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I would say let's think about finding someone to talk to, maybe, and work it through in a more sort of intense way. We can discuss that afterwards, maybe. Cool. I've got to go in about 5 minutes, so yeah. Okay.
I just wanted to take it back to where you mentioned that your partner wasn't out in the
Yeah.
relationship. Do you think that not being out, let's say you're both obviously
Yeah.
queer, and not being out can be a reason to end a relationship? And a follow-up question to that is, if you want to be in a relationship with somebody that's not out, how do you navigate that space that it's
Yeah.
still a healthy relationship?
It's a tough one. I mean, let me just separate it from my partner, in case he's watching. Just say, hypothetic. I think, for example, what could happen if the one person is out, your not out partner meets your whole family, and they love and welcome and include them, but you don't have that same experience of their family. That can feel lopsided. You could find that if their parents come to visit, if you're living together and their parents come to visit and you have to leave your own home in the interest of presenting a particular view of that home or your partner to the world, I think that could be a reason that puts your relationship under strain. You know, if their family places certain expectations on them, and this can go across many cultures where people say my family is everything to me and they can call me any time of the day or night and I will go. But if in the going their family don't know that they're leaving you behind, it can feel as if you matter less. If it's the other way around, for example, so if the person who is out gets a call from their family might say, is so and so okay? Bring them with you. You know, so all of those things that kind of family engagement can make you feel closer to your partner. Because I think one of the things that helps relationships thrive is the kind of glue of the love of your friends and your community and your family. If that is intact, it kind of adds another layer of the webs that hold your relationship together. But if you think about the time I grew up, queer people might have had relationships where their family never knew they were gay. And they lived their whole life in a relationship, separate. That kind of relationship's under a lot of pressure to survive.
All right. Thank you, Pierre.
That's a heavy note to end on. Can we do something lighter?
Maybe you can end off on something lighter for us, or any closing thoughts.
You may have something light.
Yeah, what's your TikTok?
I don't post. Is that the right word?
Yes.
I'm just an observer. I love it. Clearly I'm obsessed. Hours pass when I'm on TikTok, but yeah.
You know, you said a lot of things about the 90s, the 80s, the 70s. Please drop your skincare routine.
Joke on that. We can end on a lighter note. I'm over 60 now. Okay. So I now am taking the senior benefits of certain stores, like Game and Macro. But I went there during the weekend, I think, and I handed my senior card, and the cashier looked at me. So I hauled out my ID card, and she said, "You don't look this age." So I was very chuffed about that. I mean, I'm vain enough to want that to happen to me. Answers: don't go into the sun. It's the single most important thing you can do. Thank you for that. And thank you for having me. I really, really enjoyed being here tonight.
Thank you for being here. We appreciate the knowledge that you shared with us. I think this was very informative. You guys agree. Yes, good.